If you're focused on your freedom, there's a lot of people in the media and in everyday life who think that you are a tin foil hat wearing freak. Today I'm going to share an article where they literally use some of that terminology and yet begrudgingly admit that if you're concerned about CBDCs, you might be onto something. So I'm going to share with you an article from the Financial Times, the reasonable case against CBDCs, because of course, if you don't agree with the Financial Times, you're not reasonable. Do you know what else isn't reasonable? Diversifying your money overseas, having multiple residence permits, having at least one second passport, the stuff we talk about here at Nomad Capitalist, the stuff we help our clients do because, quite frankly, when times are crazy, you don't want to be reasonable. And the older I get, I realize, I hope the average person thinks I'm not reasonable, not because I'm doing something wrong, but just because I'm prepared for what they're not prepared for. So a little bit of culture war content is a treat, they say. They're throwing you a bone. Here's what the Financial Times has to say from a British perspective about CBDCs. A few years ago, CBDCs were the domain of policy wonks. Today, they're a topic of growing political importance, and among fringe groups, creeping paranoia. Although the exact nature of CBDCs vary from country to country, their overarching nature is that of a digital version of physical cash, because they haven't thought of credit cards yet. Money issued by the central bank, unlike cryptocurrencies, which are created by private entities. So basically they're saying it's like a cryptocurrency, except by your friends at the central bank. Now, I will admit, there's probably some people who are concerned about CBDCs who go further than I would go. They have concerns that perhaps I don't have. Maybe I'm getting soft in all these years of living in more free countries than my home country of the United States. Maybe I'm not as extreme as some just by default. I don't know. I do think that having a toe in multiple other countries is going to make you less concerned about the stuff that's happening in the big Western countries. The UK is the one they're talking about here. The US is one where a lot of folks are concerned. I think once you get out of that ecosystem and you go and put some money in other countries, you go and spend some time in other countries, you're going to realize not every country wants to jam this stuff down your throat. But let's continue with the article. CBDCs have gotten tied up in the fringe Great Reset. The World Economic Forum is run by lizards narrative. I don't spend too much time thinking about lizards, but also includes plenty of voices making more grounded arguments, including noting a lack of clear communication. Financial Times Alphaville, they've called it, is here to hopefully make the case that wonky and paranoid are not mutually exclusive descriptors. Let's say it explicitly. It's completely reasonable, sensible even, to be concerned about CBDCs. Now, aren't you glad you got a permission slip from the Financial Times? Two overwhelming reasons for this, they say. Number one, people should always be hesitant about potentially giving up rights to their government, even if they trust their government. Number two, even if people currently trust their government, they should operate on the basis that they may not always trust their government. Two very interesting points. Now, I grew up around hearing, number one, that there were up-and-coming places around the world that may be more interesting for me as an adult, and I think that's proven to be true. And that, the government where I was from was kind of heading in the wrong direction. I think over the years, we've seen that a lot of Western governments have proven not to be trustworthy. We've talked here on this channel. Europe, they lied about CBDCs. They lie about a lot of stuff. And so if you're trusting your government, we probably disagree on some things, but whether you trust them or not, why would you give up your rights? Why would you not want to have as many options as possible? We talk here about having bank accounts in multiple countries legally, fill out the paperwork, do it legally, having multiple residence permits so that you're better than a tourist and no matter what happens, you have a place to go, having multiple citizenships. So if things really get bad, hey, I don't want you to be your citizen anymore. I'm going to go over here. But what I think is most interesting about this is, even if you currently trust your government, imagine there may be a day when you don't. And I think that's one thing that even some viewers of this channel overlooked, in that we've had more people coming to us. They want to be a client. They say, I enjoyed watching you, but I never thought I would need the service. I never thought I would want to get that residence permit or that dual citizenship. I never thought I would want to open up a trust somewhere offshore to protect some assets. because I realize now I don't trust my government. I'm not totally done with them yet. I kind of still want to stay here. I'm not moving overseas, but you know what? I think it's going to get worse. This is why I say you want multiple options. Not because if you move from the United States to Mexico, that Mexico is the panacea, you're going to ride off into the sunset forever. Nothing lasts forever. Countries change. The reason why I think Western countries are worse is because they're the ones that refuse to be competitive. They're not lowering their tax rates to keep up. By and large, the U.S., you think lowering your tax rate from 39.6 to 37, that doesn't make a dent. That's not competitive. The big Western powers don't want to be competitive. They want to use their power to push back. And so if you understand that's going to lead to increased distrust, well, let's continue. That's enough undergraduate stuff. So what has actually been said? FT continues. We're going to focus on Britain here because it's the case they're most familiar with. Britain has a well-established and fairly decent democratic system. I don't know about the UK. In the US, record numbers of Americans are fed up with democracy, for whatever that's worth. Speaks more to the fact that they just don't think the country's working. And an advanced financial system, creating probably the ideal conditions for a CBDC that isn't ethically dead on arrival by being, for example, explicitly a means of controlling the population. This is where I take umbrage. I have a lot more confidence in, and I've said this before, St. Lucia, for example, or some smaller country that just doesn't have as much of a mechanism to control the population than I do in a larger country like the UK. This idea that somehow because they're a large country with a legal system that they're only good people go into politics and banking in the UK. I happen to actually think it's the opposite. And I think the reason why we talk about smaller countries and less powerful countries is, you know what, maybe those politicians, if they were politicians in the US or the UK, maybe they'd act exactly the same way. But they can't, and it's embedded into them. Nobody who's a politician on some island ever thought, you know what, one day we're going to take over this joint. They're just like, yeah, we run our little island. I was in Monaco recently. They do some stuff, but it's just like, what are we doing here, I actually think it's the opposite. Alphaville has done a couple of big posts on Britcoin. That's the UK's CBDC they're working on, the popular moniker for the digital pound being proposed by the Bank of England. The first article they wrote examined the Bank of England's arguments for why it needs to create a digital pound, and they found them lacking. Again, aren't you glad we have the folks at Financial Times Alphaville to tell you that, all right, it's okay to find these arguments lacking. The second article, they said, looked at the proposed system to which a digital pound could be utilized. Here's the TLDR. The Bank of England's proposals are based around a wrapper system in which Threadneedle Street develops a centralized ledger for transactions, and then third parties develop service applications, think banking or budgeting apps that plug into the ledger. We didn't really look at the ethical side of things back then because it's all a little bit intangible. At this stage, a lot of the things we know about Britcoin are just us accepting official statements at face value, and when has that ever gone wrong? But those statements are a key matter here. And again, we talked right here about how Europe, they said we're not going to do certain things, and now they're saying they are. The UK was kind of caught in some of the same kind of thing where, hey, we'll never do this, and then it comes out like, well, wait a second, how could you never do this if it's that? All right, you got us. These statements, Financial Times says, create something that might be called a credibility vacuum. I like that. Which is being exploited by people trying to turn CBDCs into a wedge political issue. Here's what the UK Treasury said. Under these proposals, the digital pound will be as private as the card payments and bank accounts that millions use every day, says the Treasury. And for some people, by the way, they prefer to use cash. There's plenty of places in the world where there is no war on cash. Go to many parts of Asia, for example. Go to many emerging countries. People are still using cash. So already we've shifted it to, you don't need the privacy of cash. Hey, listen, as long as we, start at card payment level, well, that's fine. There are people who think that, the government eventually will track, card payments more and deny you certain services. Hey, you went to the liquor store too often, NHS isn't going to pay for your health care. Anyway, the Treasury continues. This means that neither the government or the Bank of England can access anyone's personal data or see how people are spending their money. Do you really believe that? Do you really believe the government of Western countries that provide so many services, and that they're broke, that they're not going to try and figure out ways to means test? I mean, even like people in the right wing now in the United States are saying, let's means test Social Security. You paid a tax that you thought you were going to get that money back your entire life. You know, we're just going to throw you under the bus. It's our money. It's not really your money. The whole thing was a ruse. That's what the right wing, the allegedly fiscally conservative people are saying. Do you really think that the governments in these countries, the left-wing governments, are not going to see how you're using your money? They're going to dig in deeper to try and protect themselves and score political points? Really? Useless. Useless, the Financial Times says. Rebuttal: as private as the card payments and bank accounts, which they're right, tells us absolutely nothing, and indeed suggests, as FT says, they may not be very private at all. Banks have to monitor transactions. Yes, I mean, Nigel Farage is speaking at Nomad Capitalist Live 2024. He had the issues with his bank account. He's one of many in the UK. He's just the one that has the microphone to talk about it, and he will be talking about it this year at our live event. Banks, of course, monitor transactions. In some countries, when you go to get a residence permit, the government does very little screening of you because the requisite to getting the residence permit is put some money in the bank. And there are countries where they're like, hey, if the bank accepts you, they'll go through their rigorous due diligence, then we're cool. Like, okay, click a police check and off you go. The banks could be the ones having this foisted onto them. The government could say, well, we don't know what's going on, but put the requirement onto the bank and then get the data through the back door. The FT continues, plus society has come up with many delightful ways, such as landlord checks on tenants in which people are forced to share intimate details from their accounts. I mean, there's tons of due diligence in these countries, which is, by the way, when you come to some of the countries that we're talking about, obviously the banks do due diligence and they do KYC and they have requirements, and obviously the government does its checks. But it is more laid back in some countries. There's a lot less information sharing going on when you live in some of the countries that we're talking about. You may not have some of the creature comforts, but this is one reason why I think that anyone who's concerned about this stuff and lives in a Western country should have a residence permit in a country that is a little bit different. Could be in Latin America, could be in Southeast Asia, could be in emerging Europe, even could be somewhere in Africa. We see more Europeans getting residence permits in Africa. And you want a second citizenship from a small country. You want a fallback plan. Cash somewhere else, residence permit somewhere different, citizenship somewhere small. That's going to be your fallback plan. Also, rebuttal, that the Bank of England cannot access anyone's personal data. Well, says FT, maybe because that capability would be outsourced. Well, here we are. Would be outsourced to companies that provide the services. Right, exactly. So they go around the back door. They say, oh, we're not doing it. It's American Express, just as an example, they're the ones doing that. And then, somehow the data gets funneled back. It also does nothing to address one of the biggest concerns skeptics have, that CBDCs could be used to control spending. Hey, we don't know what you're spending on, but if you try and spend at a liquor store, we're just going to stop it. Or, hey, if you have one of those nasty YouTube channels, we're just going to, put certain restrictions on you. And so let's double click on that last point. This is about programmability, the idea that users or operators of the CBDC could set restrictions on how that money is spent. In one of the Bank of England's main non-technical consultation papers, it says there are already examples of the direction in which the digital pound could support innovation through improved functionality for users, such as programmability. Technology is emerging that allows users to set rules to limit their spending on certain products, for example, on gambling, or to automatically save a small amount of money after each purchase. Do you know how you save a small amount of money after each purchase? You move out of the UK or your Western country to somewhere that taxes you a lot less than the 40% they tax, and you put that money in your savings account, and you don't have some CBDC try and do it for you 1 penny at a time. This technology builds on existing familiar applications like direct debit. And so, of course, the FT points out what a lot of people are going to say. Oh, that sounds useful. Wouldn't it be nice to save money 69 pence at a time? That'll be great. In the same country where even the right-wing politicians who are supposed to be like, hey, it's your money, are literally saying the money that's in retirement accounts should just be like, we need that for poorer people. Like, we want to get reelected, so it's not your money anymore. Why would you save into a system like that? The other reaction, FT says, you could get from all this Bank of England funny business is if the government gets this power, they could use it to control how I spend. Well, that's kind of the goal of the government, is to control what you do. FT says both thoughts are completely reasonable, but one is clearly a much more serious matter. Yeah, saving money for retirement. You don't need a CBDC to force you. You can save today. You can save money today. What's more serious is that the government controls how you spend money. And so this article from the FT goes on and on and on and on. You can check it out on their website. But for me, the formula is simple. Asset diversification, residence permit, citizenship. That's the formula for a number of things we talk about. And we mentioned one of them. This is how they treat you, and you pay them this much in tax. You could make some argument to say, hey, if I went and lived in some 0% tax place, people mention Saudi Arabia, for example. All right, I get I'm going to have fewer freedoms, but I'm saving a boatload of money. Now, we had Zuby at the last Nomad Capitalist Live who grew up there and said it's a great place to live. That was his recommendation. That's before they even opened things up more. So probably the places that you think aren't as free, quite frankly, might be more free than you think. But even if we assumed, all right, fine, the price of saving a boatload of money is you have some restrictions. You're not saving anything in the UK, the US, Canada. These countries are taxing you at the wazoo. And this is how they treat you as a thank you. So you might as well find a place to live where cash is still accepted. If you want, listen, I use cards all the time, but sometimes I use cash. You might as well find a place where you can go and live the way you want, pay a lot less in tax, maybe zero in some countries. There's dozens of countries around the world that will allow you to do that, and they'll give you a residence permit. And even if you don't move there right away, why not have the residence permit so you can? Because the price of these things is going up. And imagine if you have a bunch of people from the Western world who all want to get out, it's going to be more expensive. And so those are the three things that you need. Now, I've been diversifying myself for well over a decade. I've been looking into this stuff since about 2006. And we built a business that helps people do this. You can go to nomadcapitalist.com and learn how it works. I think you need a plan. What a lot of people are going to do is just to sit and say, hey, let's vote for some politician or some senator or some member of parliament that's going to stop this. I think the government machine is going to go in the direction, as one of my colleagues says, the train is moving. It's just going to push everyone out of the way. And that's what happens in countries that are drunk on power, don't want to be competitive, and are kind of clinging on to the last vestiges of power as there becomes more competition in the world. I don't think sitting around and voting because a couple of senators want to make CBDCs illegal, I don't think that's the answer. The answer is having a suite of global solutions to where you have different ways to pivot as the wrench turns.